to share some of my work that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the awesome professors that I had in the School of Ed at Geneseo and in the history department where I did my concentration. And I'm really excited to share some of the research that I've done, all because I really think because of one of my fourth grade students, my first year of teaching, asked me if Rochester had had problems with racism, or if it had had Martin Luther King had ever come here, or if segregation had been a problem in the past. Because we learned about Martin Luther King and Ruby Bridges and stuff like that, kind of your typical, and I tried to dig deeper and talk about the different leaders in the South and more than just Martin Luther King, like my professors taught me. But one of the things I realized was I didn't know anything about civil rights or racist policy in Rochester. And so I said to the student, I'll look into it. I have no idea, but I'll look into it. I didn't learn about this growing up, and I'll get back to you. And I started learning all these amazing things about Dr. King coming to Rochester, about Malcolm X coming to Rochester, Connie Mitchell being the first woman of color to be elected to public office, about redlining and racial covenants, and a whole host of other things that went on in our community that I think direct also the Geneseo area as well. And I hope to share a little bit of those racist policies as well as the ways people have fought back, and then share a little bit about the way the Antiracist Curriculum Project, the PathStone Foundation, is working to equip teachers to tell this story to their students using an inquiry model. And before I begin though, take a look at this front page. You'll see Rochester's redlining map, a defining racist policy of this area that did affect Geneseo. And on the right, you'll see the Reverend Gibson of Memorial AME leading what may have been the first Black Lives Matter protest on the front steps of City Hall in 1962 after Rufus Farwell was handcuffed by police officers, brought downtown, and then brutally beaten within an inch of his life. We'll talk more about him, the connection between this protest movement around policing and the connection between racist housing policies, urban renewal, and a whole host of other things. And I'm really excited to share some of it and how we talk about it with kids. So let me just make sure I'm in the right place here. This is my team at the Antiracist Curriculum Project. Kelly McNair and Keisha James are our co-leads on the project, and this is our amazing writing team of anti-racist educators across our community who have come together and developed 5-day units of study in grades 4, 8, and 12 that help tell this story using inquiry, and I'll talk a little more about that at the end. But some of the sources that you're going to see today in this presentation, the first most important comes from Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, the defining book on racist housing policy in the United States. We brought him here with PathStone, and he presented. I got to be on a panel with him, and he's gone through most of this work and given us some really great insight on how to take that national story and tell it locally, which you'll see here. The Rochester Democrat and Chronicles newspaper archives, you're going to see a ton of great images and text from there, as well as the New York State Commission Against Discrimination from '58 and the Rochester Voices Project at the Public Library, as well as quite a few interviews that I've done myself with people of color who were leaders, both past and present, in the resistance movement against racism in our community, who I've had the chance to know through my work in the Beechwood neighborhood in Rochester. A couple of things I want to kind of level set with us before we start from Ibram Kendi's book, some great definitions that when you hear me reference these words, I want to make sure you know what I'm talking about. Racism being a marriage of racist policies and ideas to produce and normalize racial inequality. And these racist policies are being any measures that produce and sustain these inequalities between racial groups. And being a racist, it doesn't matter how good your intentions are. I'll never forget being a student at Geneseo and saying to a student of color that I did not see their color. I said, I treat everyone the same. I don't see race. That's what I was taught. And the student got really angry at me and said, you're being racist. And I was like, I felt defensive. I felt anger. And then I decided to listen. And the student shared with great grace and kindness towards me that were not deserved, that when I said something like that, I was being racist because I wasn't seeing an important part of who they were. And I also wasn't seeing the racism that was impacting them still, both on campus and across the world. And I wasn't being a part of actively participating in dismantling that. And that really floored me. And it led me to get involved with BSU at Geneseo and the Korean American Student Association, where I just learned and listened and realized it wasn't my intentions that mattered. It was the impact of my actions and the action that I was taking to dismantle racism, racist ideas, and policies. And the goal is to be an anti-racist, someone who actively supports an anti-racist policy, that key word being action. And we're going to talk a lot about that throughout. Because here's the thing, in our community, slavery, has really shaped the early stages after the removal of a majority of the Native American population, the Haudenosaunee, in places like Geneseo and Rochester. The colonial settlers came in, folks like Penfield, Rochester, Gates, the Wadsworths in Geneseo, Henrietta, all of those folks owned enslaved people. Right in Geneseo at the Wadsworth Mansion, folks of color were enslaved. And this started to build this community. But people, of course, came together, they faced it head on, and they fought back, like Frederick Douglass and the great Austin Stewart, who was actually enslaved. And so does New York, escaped to Rochester, and there opened the first school for African Americans and a station on the Underground Railroad. A really incredible story that's worth looking into that I teach my kids every year about the way he helped mobilize the community in Rochester to organize against slavery. And on the day of abolition in New York State, he was the one who got to give the address with a governor announcing that, and then continued to work for the abolition across the country. And the thing is, while we've come together in the past to fight against racist policy, we're going to have to really lean into that legacy, carry it on, and do it again. Face these issues head on, because the facts are we have huge problems in our 9-county region, which includes Livingston County. The Hard Facts report found that in 2020, Black children in our region are more than 4 times as likely than whites to live in poverty. Let that sink in, 4 times. Both African Americans and Latinos are less than half as likely to own their own homes as their white counterparts. When you look at the racial dot map from the census, you can see the suburban areas around Rochester are a sea of blue dots representing individual white folks. And the inner city of Rochester, or what many have called the Crescent, is predominantly Black and Hispanic. When you look at our schools, New York State has the most segregated schools in the country. And in Rochester, we have the most segregating school district border. The line between Rochester and Penfield is #1 in the country for segregation, and the Brighton Central School District is #6. In our community, white privilege literally means life itself, up to almost 10 years of life. A child in Pittsford zip code will live up to 9 years longer than a child from Rochester's predominantly Black, previously redlined 14608 zip code, which today is that Plymouth Exchange, Clarissa Street area. Nationally, there's an incredible gap of wealth where white families are making 10 times, or not making, but having in net worth 10 times more than Black families. So we have incredible racial disparity, disparate impact, and inequality across our community right here and nationally. And in order to address it, we have to do something that we haven't often done in our community here in Rochester. We have to face it head on. And this is really the central message of my presentation. This quote from James Baldwin, who writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I hope that today you will join me in facing head on the root causes of injustice in our community and take a look at the folks who resisted so that we might learn from their legacy and their experience and come together as a community and carry that forward. Meet Howard Coles, editor of the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper, who was one of the first people when redlining began in Rochester to publicly speak out against it, which he did in his weekly newspaper, The Voice. His daughter, Joan Coles, who also wrote on The Voice and helped her dad with it, she's on our board of directors for the Curriculum Project. And there's a whole trove of researches at the resources, all of his materials and files you can go see at the Rochester Museum and Science Center downtown, and even read the housing study that he and his newspaper published. He mobilized the Black community in Rochester, and they did this incredible survey of all the housing in the city, finding that African Americans couldn't live anywhere but 2 neighborhoods, the 3rd and 7th wards. The local government, banks, and real estate agents were the ones directly responsible for this. In these 2 neighborhoods where folks of color were allowed to live, over 30% of the units did not have running water, and in streets like Portland Avenue by the public market, over 50% of the homes didn't even have heat. And it was just incredible unsanitary conditions brought on by those white landlords and the lack of oversight through the government in our community, and just allowing these sort of things to happen. But people built on this report. Dr. Anthony Jordan, the second Black doctor in Rochester, called it out and actually did a massive study connecting housing to health inequity, finding that housing was directly linked to the much higher death rates among people of color. Finding that in Rochester, Black people were dying from all causes at 50% higher rates than that of whites. And when it came to TB, the death rate was almost 2.5 times that of whites. Connect that to 2020, where African Americans in Rochester have died because of COVID-19 at 3 times the rate. And you start to see that this is something that is not new. This is part of what happens in our community because of racism. 1946, almost 10 years later, the Reverend Body at Mount Olivet continues to speak out about this housing situation, right in the DNC, saying in Rochester, only 2 areas have been gracefully made available for him, that 3rd and 7th floor. If any attempt is made to move out of these Black ghettos, the attempt is met with opposition. And today we're going to take a look specifically at the racist opposition in the real estate industry's code of ethics, something called a racial restrictive covenant on the deed to thousands of homes across our community, the 1934 National Housing Act, where redlining comes from, but also massive government subsidies for home ownership and the construction of homes in suburban towns and places like Geneseo. We'll look at urban renewal, policing and containment, exclusionary zoning, and the anti-integration movement in Monroe County in the 70s and today. And finally, talk a little bit about what are the solutions and how we can carry the legacy of those like Coles and Body and Dr. Jordan into the days ahead. So a quick note before we really dig deep here, the period of time that we're covering is called the Great Migration. If you haven't read Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns, you've got to read it. This was a period of time in our country's history when millions of African Americans fled from the South to the North in search of better jobs, fleeing white domestic terrorism from the Klan and white citizens councils, trying to find a better life. Many folks in Rochester actually came from Sanford, Florida, where they ended up in Geneseo, Wayne County, Livingston County, not working at places like Kodak, where people of color really weren't allowed to work until the 1960s, but instead picking fruit on many of these fruit farms. Interesting to note about Sanford, there was a place of a lot of racial terror. The Ku Klux Klan burned down the head of the NAACP's house there. It's a place where Jackie Robinson was run out of town in a rail for trying to integrate their baseball field. And very recently, only a few years ago, Trayvon Martin was killed for wearing a hoodie and eating Skittles. The first area of racist policy I want to talk about, though, is the real estate industry and the National Association of Real Estate Boards that governs all the real estate agents across our country. And they have a code of ethics that the directors of this board are responsible for holding all the real estate agents responsible for. And if they don't follow it, they'll lose their real estate license. And actually, for 30 years or more, up until mid-1956, the code of ethics read, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race, nationality, or any individuals whose presence will be clearly detrimental to the property values in this neighborhood. We know this was enforced in Rochester because Frank Drum, who is one of the leaders and president of the Rochester Real Estate Board, actually ran Howard Coles out of the industry. Coles, who worked for The Voice, who did that housing study that you saw, he got his real estate license to directly challenge the racism going on here in the real estate industry. And he began showing homes to people of color in the all-white 19th Ward neighborhood. Very quickly, he was forced to do it under the cover of night. They wouldn't allow him to show homes during the day. And then eventually they forced him completely out of that industry. Meanwhile, folks like Dr. Alice Holloway Young, who helped found Monroe Community College, later was the first Black principal in the Rochester City School District. She founded the Urban Suburban program to further integration across our community. Well, in 1957, she and her husband, James, excuse me, they wanted to buy a house in the 19th Ward, which was outside of the Red Line neighborhood. It was a 100% white neighborhood in Rochester. And not a single real estate agent in town would show them a home, and not a single bank in town would pre-approve them for a mortgage. This is an upper middle class family. She had her doctorate from the University of Rochester, and yet no access. So she did what the about 57 other people of color were able to do at this time, according to the New York State Commission on Discrimination. They found a wealthy white person. She found Harper Sibley of the Western Union Telegraph fortune to actually buy her a house on Millbank Street in the 19th Ward, sight unseen. She never got to go inside, didn't get to tour it. And Harper Sibley lied in the paperwork and said that Alice was actually her niece, and then deeded the house over to her and did a private mortgage so that she could buy it. Now, the Youngs were really afraid about moving into the house because the Ku Klux Klan was a strong force in Rochester at that time. They moved in under the cover of night with just one suitcase and a crib because they were really concerned about like having the moving truck in the light of day. They thought it'd be easier if we moved in kind of slowly. Well, the next morning in their mailbox, they had this incredibly offensive, horrific note that I will not read to you, signed by the Ku Klux Klan of Millbank Street. The note went on to say that they were going to burn their house down if they did not leave the 19th Ward. Well, Dr. Young happens to be a good friend of mine. We've gotten to work together, have lunch and talk. I talked to her a couple weeks ago. And when we've talked, she's mentioned that she really likes that when I give this presentation, that I include that there was one white family on the street that stood with them as they stood up against this racism. The Bush family was the one family who stood up for them, eventually helped them get the FBI involved, and helped them stay in that house for the next 17 years. But Alice's story it's not an uncommon story. This was something that happened across our community. We don't think of Rochester or Monroe County or Livingston County as a Klan area, but take a look at this photograph on the front page of the Democrat and Chronicle in 1926. 8,000 fully hooded, white-robed Klansmen burning 3 50-foot high flaming crosses in what is today the football field at East Rochester High School. The next day, 20,000 robed Klansmen did a parade down the main street of the city. This is Rochester, New York, not Arkansas, not Mississippi. And if you know anything about things like Birth of the Nation, it comes out of that period of time. The next area I want to talk about is something called racially restrictive covenants. So we all know that really public symbol of segregation that many of us were taught growing up in the South of the white and black water fountains, like really in-your-face public segregation. Well, the just as public form of segregation, but not as in your face, is a racial covenant on a deed. This summer, I had the opportunity to work with City Roots Community Land Trust and my students and the lawyers at Yale Law School and their Environmental Protection Clinic to do a massive study on all of the racial covenants in Monroe County. Much of this work coming out of my students' questions, their investigations, going down to the clerk's office and digging some of these deeds up. And we did this extensive report that showed that when people in Monroe County bought a house in a ton of neighborhoods across the county, and this is the same for Livingston County, oftentimes individuals and real estate developers, the federal government, and all kinds of different companies actually put covenants into the deed that explicitly and legally enforceably said the dwelling shall be occupied by persons of the Caucasian race only. And it wasn't until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act that these were officially done away with. And when you look at these neighborhoods today, they remain over 98% white in most of these places in Monroe County. Take a look right here. These are some of the places that we have found them so far, and you can read more about this in the report. We found about 10,000 homes that have these covenants. We estimate there's a good 20 to 30,000 homes left for us still to find. And students at U of R and RIT have now took on the project and are beginning to document these. And we're working with the real estate board to look into how we can fund this and make sure that we build a more accurate map and then can publicly say whenever a neighborhood, like just recently, the Meadowbrook neighborhood, put an anti-racist covenant into their deed, denouncing the racist one and putting in a statement of welcome. Though it's really important, though, that you understand the full scope and scale. This wasn't some kind of fringe thing or something just a few people did in our area. This was national, but locally, take a look at our county manager, Clarence Smith, and the entire Monroe County legislature. On the tax foreclosed properties that they would acquire and then resell, when they went to resell all of them, on them they would put this statement, that no person of any race other than the Caucasian shall ever use or occupy the lot unless they are a domestic servant employed by the people who live there. Brighton, New York, the Meadowbrook neighborhood, 371 homes, and their website described as a carefully planned development. It was so carefully planned that when Kodak, George Eastman and Vice President Harry Haight decided to build this neighborhood for their all-white employees at the time, they wanted to make sure that this neighborhood stayed 100% white. And on every deed, it explicitly said people of color could never own or occupy one of these homes. ESL Bank, one of the largest banks in our area, was actually founded to finance these whites-only mortgages in this community. The DNC was involved, advertising these racial covenants. Take a look at the Council Rock neighborhood in Brighton. Rigid restrictions for desirable social character. And there's the deed that's still on these deeds at the county clerk's office. School districts like Thomas Edison and Gates, now Hope Hall, the school board and town board actually put into the land that this lot should never be used or occupied by members of any race except the Caucasian. That's 1941, de jure school segregation right here in Monroe County. Pittsford, all along Oak Hill, hundreds of homes, Fairport and Parrington, all throughout Irondequoit. Northwest Irondequoit has one of the biggest white enclaves, over 2,000 highly restricted lots advertised in the paper by Grafton Johnson, the builder. Walter Wegman, founder of Wegman's Food Markets, agreed to one of these racial covenants when he bought his home. And then even though he didn't have to because the deed had been up, he ensured that that racial covenant stayed on when he and his wife Anna sold their home the next time. You'll notice in towns like Webster, Italian and Polish were also added to the list along with Black. You can see here all throughout Penfield, quite a few neighborhoods of Greece, Jewish people often included in these covenants. Gates, the president of the Rochester Builders Association, putting hundreds of these on the properties. The head of the Rochester Bar Association, Early F. Case, putting hundreds of these on the homes that he and his firm built, all throughout the city of Rochester, including the 19th Ward, where Judge Reuben Davis, who later became the first Black judge in Rochester and all of Monroe County, excuse me, describes his situation fighting back against racial covenants, trying to move 1 year later after Alice Young moved into the 19th Ward. He says, "My wife and I were looking for a house in 1958, saw a house we liked on 135 Elmdorf Avenue in Rochester, just a block or so west of Geneseo. I'd say there were probably 4 Black families that lived anywhere west of Geneseo Street at that time. The owner refused to sell to us because we were Black. There was a restrictive covenant in the deed that these houses, when built, were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians." Before I go on, Italians, Jewish folks, Polish people that lived here, in 1944, they officially became white, and these deeds no longer applied. They had access to FHA and VA loans because of the GI Bill. Whereas people of color who fought in World War II, they came back and did not have that same access to have the GA Bill help fund their purchasing of homes, really until 1968. So Davis goes on and says, "I was active in the NAACP at the time. So a white friend bought the house, that's the house right there, and he transferred it to me. We had to go through devious methods in order to find housing. And this was pretty typical at the time for getting decent, safe housing, even if you could afford it. To my knowledge, there were very few persons of color living in any of the towns, very few in Henrietta, none in Pittsford, few in Irondequoit, and none in the town of Webster, and practically none in the towns west of the city." So racial covenant starts around 1910 is when it really begins its heyday, and up until 1948 is when they start to wind down, being put into different places. But not until in the 1930s, the federal government began to codify them and really created the suburbs across our country with the passing of the National Housing Act. In response to the Great Depression, FDR, who was president, of course, FDR was from New York, as well as Senator Wagner, who was a key figure in passing this law. In this National Housing Act, they allowed for incredible subsidies to allow white folks to buy homes. This act creates the 30-year mortgage, the FHA, and eventually the VA loan. And for VA folks being able to put no money down and get a 30-year low-interest fixed mortgage, it allowed over 35 million families, all white, access to home ownership and to wealth for the first time in our country's history. And we know that this was a whites-only proposition and policy from the federal government because explicitly in the underwriting manual, written by, FDR actually hired the people in Chicago that were like inventing the racial covenants. It was Frederick Babcock was the guy that he hired to run the FHA, who wrote this right into the law, saying that if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Any change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values. A racist idea there at the bottom that they never had any proof for, whereas the policy above it, making sure that those racial groups are separated, they really put into force. And one of the ways they did that was by codifying those racial deed restrictions, saying they should be imposed on all land, prohibiting the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they're intended. So if any builder, like the Levitt brothers, who built almost like something like 8% of all suburban developments during this 10-year period, they had to put racial covenants on all their homes in order to get federal financing to buy their materials up front. The same happened with Norman Huck and Gates and quite a few other places in Monroe County. But also written into this act were protective barriers against inharmonious racial groups, saying that high-speed traffic arteries or wide street parkways should prevent the expansion of our inharmonious uses. And so for Rochester to build 490 in the inner loop, to get that over $35 million in federal funding through urban renewal funds that Rochester got, they had to make sure that their plan separated Black and white neighborhoods. And you'll see 490 separating that 3rd ward from the city and that 7th ward from the inner city or from the downtown area. This like moat around downtown Rochester, in part mandated by the federal government. It's really tricky though, because I think we have some cognitive dissonance. I know I did, learning that FDR from New York State was responsible for one of the most racist policies since slavery to be enacted into law in our time. And Ibram Kendi gives us a way to think about this, saying time and again, powerful and brilliant men and women have produced racist ideas in order to justify the racist policies of their era. But another way, in the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, the author writes, the ultimate goal of racism was the profit and comfort of the white race, specifically of rich white men, of which I'd absolutely include myself, my father, and both of my grandfathers, both of whom in the 1950s and early 1960s received VA mortgages that were 30-year loans financed and subsidized by the federal government, not having to put any money down, being able to buy a home, build equity and wealth in that home, buy bigger homes, use that wealth and equity to send both of my parents to college, to help send me to college. And that generational wealth was really created largely because of this federal policy. And when I think about this and the ways that generational wealth has benefited me, one of the things that really sticks out is that right out of Geneseo, I was working in a really poor paying teaching job. I just started. I crashed my car on the way to work. Like, wasn't looking, crashed it, over $3,000-$4,000 worth of damage. Stupid mistake, right? And for me, it was just a stupid mistake because the next day there was a check in the mail helping me pay for that. I didn't have that money in the bank, but my family did because of generational wealth through housing. Whereas someone who does not have the benefit of generational wealth, that mistake becomes a real tragedy. It becomes a crisis, right? And we know that in our country, generational wealth and wealth in general is rooted in housing, and home ownership is rooted in this policy, the National Housing Act of 1934. And one of the ways that they enforced and codified racial segregation across the country was through something called redlining, or residential security maps. The FHA tasked the Homeowners Loan Corporation with training and hiring real estate agents in cities like Rochester to go through street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, and assess and rate every neighborhood based on race and class. Neighborhoods that were green and blue were the best. They could receive federal subsidies and to buy homes and to build out those neighborhoods and to put improvements on those homes. Yellow meant declining, so still a white neighborhood, but lower interest rates, or worse interest rates, more immigrants living in those neighborhoods, older housing stock. And red meant hazardous. Hazardous was directly tied to who lived there, specifically folks of color. So if we look at the Cornhill neighborhood in 3rd Ward, this is kind of that Clarissa Street area. Many folks have called this area Black Broadway. We'll talk more about that later, but take a look. It's 75% Black at the time, 10% foreign, therefore red line. Compare that to Pittsford's East Avenue Estates that had racial covenants on every one of the homes, 0% Black, 0% foreign, and incomes would quadruple the neighborhood in Cornhill. You can compare my neighborhood, the Beechwood neighborhood. It was 2% Black and 30% Italian, so therefore redlined, hazardous, no investment. Compare that to Kodak's Meadowbrook neighborhood with the covenants. Almost 20 years after it was built, it was still 0% Black, 0% foreign, therefore best. If you're white, you can get a 30-year mortgage to buy a house and move in there, move from the working to the middle to the upper middle class, right? Meanwhile, all of our suburbs, which were honestly pretty small villages at the time, began to balloon in size because of these laws that were getting passed. And the policy worked so well at creating segregation in our towns. In 1960, the town of Henrietta was the most integrated suburb of Rochester, with just 11 individual people of color living there. Dr. Walter Cooper, who's a good friend of mine and on the board of directors for the Antiracist Curriculum Project, has written and talked quite a bit about his experience being the first person of color, him and his wife Helen, in 1958 to buy a home in Henrietta. And they worked with the NAACP to try to bring this small group of people of color to move in solidarity and resist the racial abuse. Many families had to sue for the right to live in some of those homes in Henrietta, and it was quite a process. And Dr. Cooper says the only reason he moved to Henrietta is because it was pretty much just a big farm at the time. And the white folks hadn't been as organized as they were in the other suburbs of Rochester. He describes it as really the only place, aside from the 2 red line neighborhoods, that he and his wife had to go. Richard Rothstein gives us some more scope and scale in his book, The Color of Law, writing that the FHA and VA insured half of all new mortgages nationwide, and the other half of mortgages that were private mortgages, for the most part, followed these same policies and structures. The FHA and VA gave out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance, as well as extra billions to build public housing that was exclusively for white folks, at least until the mid-1950s to the 1960s. Here in 1957, you can see our FHA underwriter, Alfred Gerdes, breaking ground on public housing for white veterans in Brighton. We know it was whites only because Howard Coles, who you met at the beginning, he kept trying to take Black families who were married and with the appropriate number of children to apply and be able to move in. And every single time they were denied because of the color of their skin. Rothstein goes on to say that over 35 million families benefited from these FHA and VA-backed loans, like mine, and 98% of them were white. You can see here ES&L Bank giving out that first GI loan in all of New York State to one of those families. So we got to wonder that if our community is this place that's rooted in Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, the Underground Railroad, this sort of activist community that we often talk about in the Rochester area, this must have been something the government sort of did to us, or a few bad actors played in. And I think already you've seen that's not entirely the case, but there's another layer of context that's crucial to examining and understanding the way systemic racism was baked in and white supremacy was baked in to our educational facilities, including SUNY Geneseo, and all across our county through something called a Blackface minstrel show. Now, a Blackface minstrel show is a show where people dress up in blackface, burnt cork, garish, bright red lips, white students wearing these things. The main characters are called N-Men. You have Jim Crow, Jim C-O-O-N, Jim Dandy, Mr. Bones, and a Black Sambo character. They always have those in the show. They dance and sing, and they mock the intelligence of people of color, sing Confederacy songs. And these shows happened in Monroe County and Livingston County and all of the towns almost every single year between 1900 and 1968 in elementary schools like this one. This is the front page of the Honeyway Fall Times in 1960. 52 Cub Scouts in blackface. Their names are all listed below, their parents' names. I mean, talk about a celebration of segregation and a clear statement of welcome to these racist housing policies that are coming in across our country. Here's the Geneseo Normal School in 1938. Notice that the faculty and student body of the Normal School presented their Blackface minstrel show right there where some of you have taken classes. The Geneseo Fire Department, the Rotary, the Presbyterian Church, they all planned these racist shows in blackface and put them on yearly. Kodak did this, proudly publishing photographs of their executives in blackface, entertaining the employees right there in their magazine every year. The Jewish Youth Association, almost every school in the Rochester City School District put these on. This is number 5. Notice the title, The Return of Old Black Joe. Brighton High School put on their show Licorice Lights right there in their high school auditorium. Newark Junior High School, Aquinas, Allendale Private School, putting these shows on in conjunction with the Memorial Art Gallery, part of U of R, and their annual blackface shows, some of Rochester's biggest names. Look at Daniel Beach there on the left of Harris Beach Law Firm. Pittsford in 1953, they had their annual show. The Catholic Church and the Masons would put on their joint show right there at Pittsford's Town Hall in blackface. RIT had an annual show. I mean, here are all the towns so far that we found that had these annual shows, advertised for them in the paper, or had the paper write up glowing stories and reviews of these acts of white supremacy. Now, the NAACP and other people of color weren't going to sit by while this stuff happened. In 1961, the NAACP started a campaign writing letters to all these school districts, ordering them to please stop. And this one letter was published to the editor in the DNC by Quentin Primo and Flora Harris, really gets at some of what was going on here and what was so messed up, saying these blackface shows must be banned from all public and private schools, churches, and public buildings. To do otherwise will cripple permanently the attitudes of all white youth involved in these community-accepted shows towards all of the dark-skinned people of the world. Meanwhile, activists of color like Dr. Cooper and Alice Young and Coles kept pushing for change. And instead of a lot of concrete change, they got what we often get, and what we're getting right now in our community, another commission, another report. And the 1958 New York State Commission Against Discrimination, while it didn't help folks too much at the time, it really helps us understand at a granular level how these racist policies played out in our community. Finding that in the 50s, 80% of all people of color lived in just those 2 red line neighborhoods. In those neighborhoods, more than 1,600 units had either no bath or a shared bathroom, and in more than 2,000 units, there was more than one person living in each room. Connie Mitchell, the first person of color to be elected to public office, ran because of redlining. She describes the situation that was resulting in the overcrowding, saying we were living in a community bursting at the seams because there wasn't open housing. When John and I bought our house in Gregg Street, the agent told us, I can't show you houses west of Jefferson Avenue. They're not open to Black people. He's talking about the red lines. So we were confined from Jefferson Avenue back to the river to look for a place to live on the west side of the city. Growing up in Webster Central School District, I never learned the story of Connie Mitchell. And it's shocking to me that I didn't. I learned Rosa Parks, I learned Martin Luther King, but I never learned that Connie Mitchell in the 1960s became the first person of color to be elected, a pioneer in our community. And just thinking about that and the need for kids to know these stories to me just seems critical. The report goes on saying that 30% of all units in these neighborhoods had no running water, something that echoed what Howard Coles had found in Anthony Jordan over 20 years prior. And yet nothing had been done to hold those white landlords accountable in these two neighborhoods. 57 Black families were able to own a home outside of these two wards, including the Wells, who joined the Coopers and Henrietta, the Lees, and a number of other families. Meet the Bias families, Dr. Thomas and Ermina Bias. They bought a house in 1964 in West Irondequoit. Pretty soon after moving in, they had rocks and bricks thrown through their living room window and death threats. So they sold their house and they moved to Henrietta on Gatehouse Trail. But they couldn't buy the house on Gatehouse Trail, even though there were a bunch of houses available. The real estate agent wouldn't sell to them because they were Black. And they had to sue and take it all the way up to the state Supreme Court to be able to have the right to live in that house on Gatehouse Trail, where they ended up staying. The Tollivers in 1960 on Marina Drive in Brighton, they bought this house. Almost everything was done. They just hadn't signed the final paperwork. The white neighbors all banded together. They pooled their money and they bought the house in cash out from under them at the bank illegally. The Tollivers got the NAACP involved and just one of the synagogues helped out, and they fought back and they won the right to live in that house where Peter lived for the rest of his life. Ellen Stubbs in Greece, first person to own a home on Long Pond Road. She was smart with what she did. She had a white friend of similar economic background, and the two of them went separately on the same day and asked to see if they could look at some homes. Ellen and her husband were told there's no homes available. We're completely sold out. After her white friend shows up and they tell her, oh, we've got tons of homes available. Let's show you each of these different options that you have. So Stubbs and her friend, it was this thing called checkers that was going on at the time. They took that, they sued, and she won the right in 1963 to buy and move into that home. She ended up moving back to the city because the community still wasn't that welcoming. In 1958, the report finds that not a single FHA or VA loan was given to any person of color in any of Rochester's suburbs. Meanwhile, developers like Max Farish, Norman Huck, Frank Drum, Fred Tosh, and many others made millions and millions of dollars. Millions they could not have made if the federal government had not subsidized this whites-only home construction across our community. Pittsburgh recently published a report by Barrow Architecture, their historic survey, that directly linked these federal policies to the massive population growth that happened in their town. Thanks to the redlining, Pittsburgh went from 9,000 to over 25,000 residents during this 20-year period, almost entirely because of these racist policies, and almost entirely the people who bought those homes were white. The next thing I want to talk about is urban renewal. So, and I want to talk about what life was like in these red line neighborhoods. There wasn't running water oftentimes. There were lots of problems, issues with trash pickup, rat attacks, all these different kinds of things, lead paint. And yet at the same time, people of color came together and still created a beautiful community, a neighborhood where people felt safe, where they knew their neighbors, and where art was something that happened. Shep's Paradise, the Pithod Club, some of the biggest jazz stars of the country would come to Clarissa Street to perform in these clubs. Black-owned grocery stores like Jesse Stevens Grocery, who his son, Chuck Price, is holding up a sign of that Black grocery store. Of course, there are no Black grocery stores in Rochester today. And in part, it was because this neighborhood was destroyed through something called urban renewal, a federally financed program that decimated the red line neighborhoods of Rochester. So you have almost 40 years of disinvestment, and of course, things are falling down. Instead of fixing them or putting in place some type of anti-racist policy, they call it urban renewal, and they come in and just knock everything down. They put highways like 490 up. You can see here Plymouth and Troop and Clarissa Street area, 490 in the inner loop getting built, going right through this almost entirely Black neighborhood. This project was overseen by Elmer Milliman, president of Central Trust Bank, the man on the left, and the man on the right, John Dale, who worked for the city, with a public committee of which they would not allow people of color like Howard Coles, who tried to get on that committee, oversaw this what Black activists called Black Folk Removal Program. It displaced in the 7th Ward over 886 families, knocking down Black churches, community centers, all kinds of things, putting in place like Pepsi factories or a few affordable housing that didn't make all enough difference for the number of people that lived there. And in the third ward, where Chuck Price and Stevens lived, over 850 families were pushed out of their homes and out of their neighborhoods. The thing is, they couldn't get pushed out that far, right? And think about how many hundreds of families and thousands of people this is getting displaced from their homes. And yet they can't go move to Geneseo. They can't move to Webster, to Penfield. They're legally not allowed to live in these places. So they end up on the outskirts of these red line neighborhoods, places like Jefferson Avenue, which was a predominantly white street and then became a predominantly black street. Because as people came packing in, white folks, realizing their homes didn't have value, banks wouldn't finance black people to be able to buy those homes, white folks would take a single family home and chop it up into 5 apartments with a shared kitchen and bathroom, creating incredible overcrowding and really dangerous and difficult conditions. And the city had a choice. What do we fund to solve this problem? We can end redlining, we can build housing, we can try to open up our suburbs and the other areas that are whites only in our city, or we can fund the Rochester Police Department. And that's what they chose to do. With a policy of containment, trying to keep people in those redlining neighborhoods, much like they are today. Jefferson Avenue was one of those lines, and it was this past spring that Daniel Prude was killed in police custody on Jefferson Avenue, one of those streets that was created because of these policies. And one example is Rufus Fairwell. Take a look at the man on the right. He's sitting in a wheelchair after the brutal beating that he received in police custody in one of these streets because he was locking up the gas station that he owned. But police officers saw his black skin and arrested him for trying to rob it. And the next day, a massive protest was led by his pastor, the Reverend Gibson of Memorial AME. Fairwell got up and he spoke, he and his wife, and they stood up and fought back, trying to create change because of these containment and policing policies directly connected to redlining. But it wasn't just Fairwell. It was A.C. White, it was the Faison case, the Black Muslim trials, and a whole host of other instances where these white police officers not from those neighborhoods, but from the suburbs and other white neighborhoods, just like the police department is today, participating in these policies. One of these folks, Dr. Kenneth Woodward, who's really often called the father of community health in Rochester, a person of color who fought back. He opened health clinics at the Baden Street settlement in the 7th Ward and did everything that he could and realized it wasn't just medicine that was going to be enough. One of the health effects was from the police department, and he helped found the Rochester Police Accountability Board in 1963. Unfortunately, this board that was supposed to hold police accountable, it was immediately defunded, which forced it to end up having to close within just a few short years. Today in Rochester, thanks to activists across our community, we have 75% of Rochesterians vote to pass a PAB with disciplinary and subpoena power to hold the Rochester Police Department accountable. And the same issue continues to present itself. They're underfunded. They don't have enough funding to really do their job. And so one of the most simple things we can do is to reach out to our city council and to our mayor in the city of Rochester and advocate that that is fully funded as one of the tools that's going to help solve these problems. But all of these policies, redlining, police brutality, the lack of running water, it leads to a massive rebellion, uprising, or what some have called a riot, on a hot summer night in July of 1964. It lasted 3 days, 1,000 people were arrested, 1,500 National Guard troops were called to quell the protest. Many of the protesters were peaceful. Some of the protesters were violent, often targeting their white landlords and business owners that were oppressing them. And it left Rochester forever changed. And Rochester wasn't alone though. Cities across the United States in their red line neighborhoods had uprisings as well. And after King's assassination and a whole other slew of uprisings in 1968, Lyndon Johnson rammed through the Fair Housing Act, which for the first time in our country's history really gave people of color the rights to full citizenship through home ownership, one of the last things, the third rail of civil rights policy in the United States. Unfortunately, while it gave people of color access to FHA and VA loans, and while it made it so that it was illegal to discriminate based on race or ethnicity, it did very little to enforce it, putting almost entirely the onus of enforcement on individuals who are being oppressed to sue these wealthy developers and builders. Then it also put the proactive side of this on Housing and Urban Development, HUD, solely to affirmatively further fair housing. And they were allowed to remove funding from block grants for like roads and sewer construction in towns that weren't doing this or weren't willing to integrate. And in fact, when George Romney tried to do this, take funds away in Warren, Michigan, a town that was failing to integrate, President Nixon fired him in order the act not be enforced. Journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones has found that from Nixon to Barack Obama, funds were removed from communities failing to integrate only twice in our country's history since this act was passed. Meanwhile, we have this incredible education movement where you have Brown versus Board, and you see these images in the South. You can see Elizabeth Eckford, very famous image, Ruby Bridges, and she's facing just incredible trauma and racial abuse and terror for just trying to go to school with integration. Well, over 10 years later in Rochester, in 1971, Rochester begins, finally, its school integration plan, because our schools were almost as segregated as the schools in the South. Not quite, but pretty close. And people like Dr. Cooper and Hannah Storrs and Alice Young were fighting hard to change that. And in 71, they had their first small victory. It was really honestly set up to fail by the school government, but I could talk about that for an hour. What's important though, is to take a look at this photograph from 1971 outside of Charlotte High School in Rochester, New York. An angry mob of white parents screaming racial epithets, throwing rocks and bricks at Black students, the first few who were coming in to integrate that school. But a few years prior, when these talks of open enrollment or integration were happening, protests were erupting across the city at high schools like Marshall High School, where an anti-Black demonstration was staged with 150 white youth and parents holding signs saying things like this: Black people go home and keep Marshall clean. Not Mississippi, Rochester, New York. In fact, the violence was incredible. James Beard, who organized the Black Student Union at Charlotte to protect himself and his fellow students of color that were integrating, you can see almost all of them pictured right there in this yearbook photo, describes the situation, saying, "We were on a bus, and as soon as we get to the graveyard, Holy Sepulchre and Lake Avenue, the white people would hide behind the graveyard wall, and they'd come out from behind it, throwing bricks, rocks, and iron, anything they could find at the bus, busting windows, and people would be screaming." The paper documents about girls of color being cut by the flying glass and rocks, and then there was violence and fights breaking out, even a noose getting hung right outside Charlotte High School with a black puppet. And this is Rochester, New York, right? And then 1 year later, the city pretty much gave up on the integration plan, and we have some of the most, literally the most segregating school district borders in the entire United States today. And one of the final reasons for this that I want to cover is because of exclusionary suburban zoning. So as civil rights is happening, these suburban towns who've been protected through redlining are starting to realize the winds are changing. We have to do something. They realized after the Fair Housing Act, we can't discriminate based on race anymore. But there's nothing illegal about discriminating based on class or discriminating based on income. So their zoning boards, who were pretty measly kind of things that weren't doing a whole lot in these towns, started to become very important. Hundreds of people started advocating and pushing and writing letters to these zoning boards saying, we want class-based exclusionary zoning in our towns. We want you to make our lot sizes bigger, mandate that houses have to be a certain value, and that no affordable housing or townhouses or apartments can get built in our towns. So all white zoning boards like Penfield's here in 1965 responded to these racial comments and racist ideas and put into place this class-based exclusionary zoning designed to price people of color out of these communities. And today, Penfield is still, it is the #1 most segregated school district in our country. And so when you look at segregation today, you can see that it directly mirrors that redlining map. Our communities, especially on the east side, predominantly being these white enclaves, where wealth is hoarded in those white suburbs and concentrations of poverty are the most acute in those redlined neighborhoods. You can see the same pattern going for owner occupancy, access to credit, which is really a modern day form of redlining that they try to say is not based on class, but just based on location, pretty much the same thing. Food insecurity rates and food deserts being the highest in those neighborhoods. Of course, there's only one Wegmans in the city of Rochester, and that's in the Green Line East Ave neighborhood. Asthma rates being the highest in these neighborhoods, mental health, high blood pressure, life expectancy. In fact, when it comes to life expectancy, red line compared to green line neighborhoods, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition found that current residents of city neighborhoods in Rochester, historically redlined, have a life expectancy of 5 years shorter than those in neighborhoods coded green, the highest rating. When it comes to COVID, 4 of the 5 zip codes for the most COVID-19 cases, at least in November, were those red line neighborhoods. And finally, we have this incredible wealth gap in our community, where for every $100 the average white family has in wealth, the average Black family has only 5. It's going to take Black families 228 years to earn the same amount of wealth that white families have today. unless we decide as a community to follow the example of Coles and so many others and live out this quote, tell the truth about what happened in our community, face it head on, and come together to solve these problems, to put into place anti-racist policy, dismantle the racist policies, and make reparation. And so to close, James Baldwin writes, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I hope you've been able to join me in facing racist policy in the real estate industry, like Howard Coles did, with racial covenants, the way Judge Reuben Davis did, with redlining, the way Alice Young and Dr. Cooper and Connie Mitchell and the biases and so many others chose to fight, urban renewal, the way that thousands protested in the street and racist public safety and policing policies. And finally, I hope that some of you today will be a part of that process in your towns to dismantle the racist exclusionary suburban zoning policies and create town comprehensive plans that are truly open and equitable and allow for more diversity is just one of those steps to help us move forward. And one of the ways that we have to do this is we have to have a critical mass of people who actually have the same story and understand what happened in our community and understand the way I'm starting to, the way my family, because of our skin color, has incredible wealth because of an unjust policy that didn't happen that long ago. And we have to make sure that our youth are taught these stories. And that's what our team at the Antiracist Curriculum Project has been doing, training hundreds of teachers in over 10 different school districts across Monroe County in how to do this. And we found that when we teach kids about racist policies, we give them Ibram Kendi's language to think about racism and anti-racism, and we give them the examples of people like Dr. Alice Holloway Young, kids follow in that legacy and they start to call things out. They're given permission to call things out. And after teaching this several years ago in my class, the girl pictured right there in the middle, she came up to me afterwards and said, Mr. Wiegand, I think our school district's racist. We don't have any Black teachers in Henrietta. I've never had a Black teacher. And I was like, you're right, that's racism. She's like, that's segregation. We have to fight that. I was like, let's do it. And she was like, well, let's go to the principal right now. And I was like, oh, we could go to the principal right now. But wait, what did Howard Coles and Alice Young and Dr. Cooper do? They got friends involved, right? They made sure they knew what their demands were. They made a plan. And so two of her friends, they joined us. We got parent permission. They came up every day at lunch and the girls researched. They found we had 550 white teachers and only 11 Black. But then they compared that to all the East Side school districts and found that our 11 Black teachers was more than all the Black teachers employed at every East Side Monroe County school district combined. They found that if you're a Black child and you have one Black teacher, your chance of graduation goes up by 30%. So they wrote a letter to the principal, they made a slide deck, they sat down and invited themselves to lunch, and they told the principal what they wanted to change at our school when it came to hiring. The principal said, wow, I don't know what to say to that. The righteous indignation of a 9-year-old is pretty hard to back down from, right? So he brought him to the school board, the assistant superintendent, and because of these girls and because of some of the leadership in our district, we formed policies with 3 historically Black colleges in Atlanta and created a recruiting pattern so that these girls can have the teacher that they truly deserve, hopefully by the time that they graduate. Sadly, they have not yet had that teacher, but the girls continue to push, try to hold our district accountable so that that is something that might happen. And imagine if 3 9-year-old 4th graders could make that big of a change in a school district. Imagine what could happen across our county if 4th, 8th, and 12th and other district-age kids start learning this story, to get language to talk about it, and choose to challenge these policies. I think we can make incredible change. An important thing, though, that I want to note is that we don't give this lecture to kids. I wouldn't want to do that. Instead, we use something called the boxing protocol, which is an inquiry-based method that incorporates the New York State social studies practices and standards. It incorporates the culturally responsive sustaining practices and the teaching tolerance social justice standards, as well as restorative practices to help kids come to their own conclusions, learn how to think critically about the primary sources I just showed you, and then use restorative circles to unpack it, have these conversations, learn how to have these conversations, and plan and strategize to make changes in their schools and their communities and across our country. Some other actions that I think are crucial for us to be thinking about is asking our school boards to teach this. In many school districts, they're starting to look at some of these things. At the U of R, the CUES program has developed a curriculum for grades 8 and 12th grade. It's very similar to ours. It's very complementary, and we've been working together to make sure that they enrich each other and deepen people's understanding. They haven't finished their work yet, but they're hoping to pilot it this spring. But we need to make sure that in all of our school districts, both in Monroe and Livingston County, that people know this history and that this history is taught. And school boards aren't going to do it unless parents reach out. In school districts like Penfield and Fairport, thousands of parents signed petitions to teach this curriculum to their kids in 4th grade. And the districts listened, and they're doing it. And we're training those teachers. You can support groups like City Roots Community Land Trust that reinvest in redline neighborhoods through permanently affordable, community-controlled land. You can advocate against zoning policies, support construction of affordable housing below 50 to 30% of the AMI, and really attack the racist housing policy at the federal level that has to do with affordable housing. It's its own hour-long lecture. Supporting groups like the Rochester Housing Justice Alliance, the Citywide Tenant Union, and Homeless Union that are working to fight the almost 9,000 evictions that are happening a year. You can work together to subsidize loans in redline neighborhoods and advocate for reparations, and as well as examine the history of your school, of your family, of the organizations that you're a part of, and name and own the racism that's happened, your complicity in it, as well as the ways that maybe we've known about some of these things but haven't taken action. And we can carry on that legacy from Dr. Cooper to those 3 girls in my classroom to make real concrete change in our community. I'll share this talk in the chat in just a second, the slides, as well as a recording and access to all of our curriculum, which is public and open source material, if you'd like to take a look. And I'm really excited to hear from all of you, your reactions, what stuck out to you, what you found interesting, maybe what you didn't know, or I'd love to hear any pushback you have. But most of all, I'm excited to just hear your thoughts and talk about how we can make our community one that is more just and equitable for all. So Crystal, I want to thank you again for having me, and I'll turn it back over to you to facilitate our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. I mean, that was such a lot of information that, I mean, I learned a lot, particularly about the local history of Rochester. And so thank you for sharing your expertise with all of us today. At this time, feel free to jump in and ask questions. You can use the chat feature, or we have a small, I think, enough group where if you want to jump in and ask a question to Shane, you may do so at this time as well. And I'm going to stop recording just to protect people's any questions they may have, and they want to keep it kind of private.